Imagine living in a desert so harsh that most people would die within days, yet you thrive there for thousands of years. Imagine knowing every plant, every water source, every animal trail across hundreds of miles of seemingly barren land. Imagine watching strangers arrive who call your home a wasteland, who claim you are primitive, who take your resources and push you aside. The Pyute people survived in the Great Basin for millennia using knowledge and skills that would put most modern survivalists to shame. But when the Old West is discussed, their story is barely mentioned. This is about the most overlooked people of the frontier, and why forgetting them means missing half the truth about the American West. The Great Basin is not one place. It is a massive region covering most of Nevada, parts of Utah, California, Oregon, and Idaho, and about 200,000 square miles of high desert, mountain ranges, dry lake beds, and sagebrush valleys. It is called a basin because water that falls there does not flow to any ocean. It stays trapped, creating isolated lakes and marshes, then evaporating under the relentless sun. To most emigrants crossing this region in the 1800s, it looked like hell. Dry, hot, empty, hostile. They called it the Great American Desert. They rushed through as quickly as possible, desperate to reach California or Oregon, where there was actual water and trees and land that looked farmable. The idea that anyone would choose to live permanently in the Great Basin seemed insane to these travelers. But the Pyute had been living there successfully for at least 1,000 years, possibly much longer. They were not one unified tribe, but rather multiple bands spread across the region, all speaking related languages, all adapted to desert survival in ways that allowed them to not just exist, but to build complex societies in an environment that white settlers considered uninhabitable. They called themselves Nuuvi or Numu, which translates roughly to the people. The name Pyute came from outside, probably from neighboring tribes, and was adopted by white settlers and government officials who needed a single name for the various bands they encountered. Northern Pyute, Southern Pyute, Owens Valley Pyute. The distinctions mattered to the people themselves, but to outsiders they were all just Pyute, all just Indians living in the desert. The Pyute survival strategy was based on incredible environmental knowledge accumulated over generations. They knew which plants were edible and when to harvest them. They knew where water could be found even in the driest months. They knew how to track animals across terrain that left almost no visible trail. They knew how to read weather patterns, predict seasons, and prepare for harsh winters that could kill the unprepared. Pine nuts were a staple food, harvested from pinyon pine trees that grew in the mountains. The Pyute would gather massive quantities in the fall, enough to sustain families through winter. They knew exactly when the nuts would be ripe, which trees produced the best harvests, how to process and store them to prevent spoilage. This was not simple gathering. This was sophisticated resource management developed through centuries of observation and experience. They also hunted rabbits, which were abundant in the Great Basin. Paiute hunters developed communal rabbit drives where entire communities would work together, using nets woven from plant fibers to trap hundreds of rabbits at once. The meat fed everyone. The fur was woven into blankets that provided warmth during freezing desert nights. Nothing was wasted. Every part of every animal served a purpose. Water sources were sacred and carefully maintained. The Paiute knew every spring, every seasonal stream, every place where water collected after rare rainstorms. They built their seasonal movements around these sources, never depleting them, always leaving enough for the land to regenerate. This was not luck or primitive instinct. This was deliberate conservation practiced by people who understood that their survival depended on the land's health. Their homes were adapted to the environment. In summer, they built simple brush shelters that provided shade but allowed airflow. In winter, they constructed more substantial wickiups, dome-shaped structures covered with brush and earth that retained heat. These were not permanent villages in most areas, because the Paiute way of life required mobility, following resources through different seasons, moving to where food and water were available at different times of year. This mobility was often misunderstood by white settlers who saw it as aimless wandering rather than what it actually was: a sophisticated seasonal round, but a carefully planned annual migration that maximized resource use while preventing overexploitation of any single area. Pyute society was organized in small family bands rather than large tribal nations. A band might consist of just a few related families, maybe 20 to 50 people total. These bands had recognized leaders, usually elders who had proven wisdom and skill, but leadership was not hereditary or absolute. A leader earned respect through competence, generosity, and good judgment. If someone made bad decisions, people simply stopped following them. This decentralized structure made sense for the environment. The Great Basin could not support large, permanent settlements. Resources were too scattered, too seasonal. Small, mobile groups could exploit the landscape efficiently. Large concentrations of people would quickly exhaust local food and water supplies, so the Pyute developed a social system that matched their ecological reality. Flexible bands that could split up or join together as circumstances required. Marriage often connected different bands, creating networks of kinship across vast territories. These connections mattered tremendously. They facilitated trade, sharing of information about resources, mutual assistance during hard times, and peaceful resolution of disputes. A Paiute person traveling through unfamiliar territory could likely find relatives or in-laws who would offer hospitality and help. The Pyute had rich spiritual traditions tied intimately to the land. Mountains, springs, and certain rock formations were sacred places where creation stories happened, where ancestors lived, where spiritual power resided. These were not abstract religious concepts. They were real places that people visited, cared for, and drew strength from. The land was not just a resource to exploit. It was alive, full of meaning, inhabited by spirits that required respect. Storytelling was crucial for passing down knowledge. Winter nights in wickiups were spent telling stories that taught children how to survive, how to behave, how the world worked. These stories contained practical information disguised as entertainment. A tale about Coyote the trickster might actually be teaching about which plants were poisonous or what happened if you did not prepare properly for winter. Stories were education, entertainment, moral instruction, and cultural preservation all wrapped together. Women held significant roles in Pyute society. They were the primary gatherers, which meant they were responsible for the majority of the food supply. They made baskets so finely woven they could hold water, pieces of functional art that took months of work and represented the pinnacle of Pyute craftsmanship. These baskets were not just containers. They were tools for processing seeds, cooking, storing food, carrying water, and dozens of other essential tasks. Men hunted and provided protection, but the division of labor was not rigid. Everyone needed to know multiple skills because survival sometimes required flexibility. A woman might hunt rabbits if needed. A man might gather plants. Children learned by watching and participating, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. The Pyute understood seasonal cycles with precision that modern people have mostly lost. They knew when different plants would bloom, when fish would run in streams, when birds would migrate through. They tracked these patterns across years, noting variations, adjusting their movements accordingly. This required constant observation, incredible memory, and the kind of environmental awareness that comes only from generations living intimately with a landscape. They also understood that the land had limits. Overharvesting would mean starvation later. Polluting water sources meant death. Depleting game populations meant hunger. So they practiced restraint, took only what they needed, gave the land time to recover. This was not romantic environmentalism. This was practical survival based on hard experience of what happened when you failed to respect ecological boundaries. But this entire way of life was about to be shattered by people who saw the desert very differently, who valued land not for what it provided sustainably, but for what could be extracted from it immediately. The first white people the Pyute encountered were trappers and traders in the early 1800s. These men came looking for beaver pelts and other furs that were valuable back east. The initial meetings were cautious on both sides. Some trappers treated the Pyute with respect, learning from them about water sources and safe routes through the desert. Others were hostile or contemptuous, viewing Indians as obstacles or threats. Trade relationships developed in some areas. The Pyute had valuable knowledge about the land. They knew where game was plentiful, where water could be found, which mountain passes stayed clear longest. Trappers who were smart recognized this knowledge as worth more than gold. In exchange for guidance and information, they offered metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured goods that the Pyute found useful. But even these early interactions started changing Pyute life in ways that were not immediately obvious. Metal knives were better than stone tools, but they made the Pyute dependent on trade to get replacements. New goods created new desires, and the trappers brought something else, diseases that the Pyute had no immunity against. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Illnesses that white people survived often killed entire Pyute families. Then came the wagon trains. Starting in the 1840s, and thousands of emigrants began crossing the Great Basin on their way to California and Oregon. They followed routes that cut straight through Pyute territory, routes that often followed traditional Pyute trails to water sources. The emigrants did not ask permission. They did not negotiate for passage. They just came, in numbers that increased every year. At first, many Pyute bands tried to help these travelers. They guided them to water. They traded food for goods. They showed them safe routes. This was partly hospitality, which was valued in Pyute culture, and partly pragmatic. If the emigrants got what they needed and moved on quickly, there would be less conflict and disruption. But the emigrants took more than they needed. They overgrazed the sparse desert vegetation with their livestock. Their cattle and horses destroyed plants that the Pyute relied on for food. They depleted water sources that took months to refill. They hunted game for sport, killing more than they could eat, wasting meat that the Pyute would have used completely. And they kept coming, more and more every year, an endless stream of wagons grinding across land that could barely support the people who already lived there. The emigrants also brought attitudes about land ownership that made no sense to the Pyute. The concept that someone could claim a spring or a valley just by planting a flag or building a cabin was foreign. Land belonged to everyone, or more accurately, to no one. You used it, you took care of it, you moved on. The idea of permanent exclusive ownership contradicted everything the Pyute understood about how humans should relate to the earth. Misunderstandings multiplied. Hungry Pyute people took cattle or supplies from emigrants, viewing it as fair compensation for resources the emigrants had consumed. The emigrants called it theft and responded with violence. Emigrants shot Pyute people for approaching their camps. Pyute warriors retaliated, attacking wagon trains. Each act of violence created justification for more violence. Fear and anger fed on themselves. Some Pyute leaders tried desperately to maintain peace. They knew that fighting these newcomers was probably futile. The white people had guns, numbers, and seemingly endless supplies. But other Pyute felt they had no choice but to resist. Their survival was being threatened. Their traditional food sources were disappearing. Their sacred sites were being desecrated. How could they not fight back? The situation grew worse after the California gold rush began in 1848. Suddenly, the trickle of emigrants became a flood. Tens of thousands of people rushed through Pyute territory, and many of them stayed, settling in areas where gold or silver was discovered. Mining camps appeared overnight, each one consuming massive quantities of wood, water, and game. The environmental destruction accelerated beyond anything the Pyute had seen before. The peaceful coexistence that might have been possible was slipping away, replaced by fear, violence, and desperate competition for resources that were rapidly being depleted. The gold strikes changed everything. Mining operations required timber for shafts and buildings, so pinyon pine forests that produced the nuts the Pyute depended on were cut down. Mining needed water, so streams and springs were diverted or polluted with mining waste. Miners needed food, so they hunted the rabbits and other game that the Pyute had carefully managed for centuries. In just a few years, the ecological balance that had sustained the Pyute for generations was destroyed. Starvation became a real threat for many Pyute bands. The foods they had relied on were disappearing. The mobility that had allowed them to follow seasonal resources was being restricted by settlements and mining claims. They faced an impossible choice. They could starve while watching newcomers prosper on their traditional lands, or they could fight back knowing they were probably outnumbered and outgunned. Some chose to fight. The Pyramid Lake War in 1860 was one of the largest conflicts. Pyute warriors, led by a chief named Numaga, who had actually tried desperately to prevent war, attacked settlers and miners in western Nevada. The immediate trigger was the kidnapping and abuse of 2 Pyute girls by white men at a trading post, but the real causes ran much deeper. Years of accumulated grievances, stolen land, murdered relatives, and destroyed resources finally erupted into violence. The Pyute won the first battle, killing over 70 volunteers who had marched out to punish them. It was a significant victory that showed the Pyute were skilled warriors when forced to fight. But it was also the beginning of the end. The whites responded with overwhelming force. The U.S. Army sent troops. More volunteers arrived. The Pyute were pushed back, defeated, and forced to accept peace terms that favored the settlers. Other conflicts followed similar patterns across the Great Basin. The Pyute would resist, win occasional battles, then be crushed by superior numbers and firepower. Each defeat meant more land lost, more restrictions on movement, more pressure to abandon traditional ways and accept whatever the government decided to give them. The U.S. government's solution was reservations. They would set aside small areas of land where the Pyute could live under federal supervision. The theory was that this would protect both Indians and settlers by keeping them separated. The reality was that reservations were usually on the worst land available, places that even white settlers did not want, with inadequate water and resources to sustain the populations forced onto them. The Pyramid Lake Reservation was established in 1859, one of the first. Other reservations followed. Walker River, Moapa River, small scattered plots that represented tiny fractions of the territories where the Pyute had traditionally roamed. Bands that had once controlled hundreds of square miles were confined to areas measuring just a few miles across. It was like taking someone who was used to living in an entire state and locking them in a single room. Life on the reservations was harsh. Government promises of food and supplies often went unfulfilled. Corruption was rampant, with Indian agents stealing goods meant for the Pyute and selling them for personal profit. The food that did arrive was often inadequate and unfamiliar. Flour and beef did not replace the diverse diet of pine nuts, seeds, roots, and game that the Pyute had thrived on. Malnutrition and disease spread through reservation communities. The government also pushed cultural assimilation aggressively. They wanted the Pyute to stop being Pyute and become Christian farmers instead. Missionaries arrived to save souls. Agents demanded that traditional practices be abandoned. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own language, forced to cut their hair, made to wear white clothing, and taught to be ashamed of their heritage. This was not accidental policy. This was deliberate cultural genocide, the systematic attempt to erase Pyute identity and replace it with white American culture. The phrase used at the time was, "Kill the Indian. I save the man." The idea was that you could destroy someone's culture while keeping them alive, and somehow this was mercy rather than cruelty. Many Pyute refused to go to reservations. They stayed out on the land as long as they could, living in remote areas, practicing traditional ways, avoiding contact with white authorities. But this became increasingly difficult as settlement expanded, as every valley found someone claiming it, as laws made it illegal to hunt or gather on land that had been Pyute territory for centuries, but was now considered private property. The violence against the Pyute was often brutal and indiscriminate. Settlers and miners did not always distinguish between peaceful bands and those who had committed acts of resistance. Being Pyute was enough to make you a target. Massacres happened that were never properly investigated or punished. In 1865, cavalry troops attacked a Pyute winter camp in northeastern Nevada. The soldiers claimed they were pursuing warriors who had raided settlements. What they actually did was kill mostly women, children, and old people who were sleeping in their wickiups when the attack came at dawn. Survivors fled into the winter landscape with nothing but the clothes they wore. Some froze to death. This was not battle. This was slaughter. Similar incidents occurred across the Great Basin. A group of Pyute killed for allegedly stealing cattle, later discovered to have been innocent. A family murdered for being in the wrong place when angry settlers wanted revenge for something they had no part in. Children shot while running away because soldiers assumed any Indian was a legitimate target. The stories accumulated, each one a tragedy. Together they formed a pattern of systematic violence against people who were already losing everything. Individual Pyute who tried to work within the white system often fared no better than those who resisted. They would learn English, wear white clothing, work on ranches or farms, do everything they were told would earn them acceptance. Then they would be cheated out of wages, denied the respect promised, or killed anyway when tensions rose. Playing by the rules did not guarantee safety when the rules could change based on prejudice and fear. The Pyute had warriors who fought back fiercely, men who became legends for their resistance, who led raids against settlements, and who refused to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. These warriors were labeled as savages by white accounts, but from the Pyute perspective, they were heroes defending their people against invasion and genocide. The difference between freedom fighter and savage depends entirely on which side you were standing on. Women and children suffered especially. They were vulnerable during attacks and had little legal protection in the white justice system. Pyute women were assaulted with impunity by men who knew they would face no consequences. Children were taken from families and placed in white homes as servants or cheap labor, told they should be grateful for the opportunity to be civilized. The trauma of these separations destroyed families and broke cultural transmission from one generation to the next. A disease continued to devastate Pyute populations. Smallpox epidemics swept through communities that had no immunity. Tuberculosis, spread by the crowded, unsanitary conditions on reservations, killed slowly and miserably. Alcoholism, introduced by white traders who profited from selling liquor to desperate people, created new forms of suffering. The Pyute population declined dramatically during the late 1800s, not from battle deaths alone, but from the cumulative effects of disease, malnutrition, violence, and despair. Some white individuals tried to help. Missionaries who genuinely cared about the Pyute as human beings, not just souls to convert. Government agents who fought against corruption and tried to ensure promised supplies actually reached the people who needed them. Or settlers who treated Pyute neighbors with decency and respect. But these were exceptions, and their efforts were often undermined by larger policies and widespread prejudice. The legal system offered no real protection. Courts rarely sided with Pyute plaintiffs against white defendants. Treaties were signed and immediately broken. Promises made by federal officials in Washington meant nothing to local settlers and miners who wanted Pyute land and resources. The Pyute learned that paper agreements could not be trusted, that laws supposedly protecting them would not be enforced, that justice was reserved for white people only. By the 1870s and 1880s, the traditional Pyute way of life was becoming impossible to maintain. The land had been so altered, so many resources depleted or made inaccessible, that the seasonal rounds that had sustained people for centuries no longer worked. Younger Pyute were growing up without learning traditional skills because there was nowhere to practice them. Knowledge that had been passed down for generations was being lost because the contexts where it mattered no longer existed. The Pyute faced a slow-motion catastrophe where everything that defined their existence was being systematically destroyed, and they were expected to accept this destruction as progress, as civilization, as inevitable and good. The reservation system was supposed to solve the so-called Indian problem, but it created new horrors. Paiute bands were forced onto lands that could not support them using traditional methods. The ecological knowledge that had allowed them to thrive in the desert became useless when they were confined to areas too small and degraded to sustain hunting and gathering. The government promised to provide food in exchange for giving up traditional territories. These promises were chronically broken. Shipments of flour, beef, and other supplies were irregular, inadequate, and often spoiled by the time they arrived. Indian agents, the federal employees responsible for managing reservations, were frequently corrupt men who saw their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment. They would record shipments that never arrived and pocket the money, or sell government supplies to miners and settlers while the Pyute starved. Life on reservations meant dependency in ways that were psychologically and culturally devastating. Pyute people who had been self-sufficient for their entire lives now had to beg for food from government agents. Men who had been respected hunters and providers became dependent on handouts. Women who had been skilled gatherers and basket makers found themselves with no materials to work with and no markets for their crafts. The government also imposed farming on the Pyute, despite the fact that most reservation land was unsuitable for agriculture. Desert soil with little water cannot grow crops without extensive irrigation, but the government rarely provided the tools, seeds, training, or infrastructure needed for farming to succeed. They just expected the Pyute to transform overnight from hunter-gatherers into farmers, as if centuries of cultural knowledge and practice could be replaced by sheer willpower. And some Pyute did try to farm. They worked hard, learned new skills, attempted to make the impossible succeed. When their crops failed due to drought or poor soil, they were blamed for being lazy or incompetent, not for being set up to fail by inadequate resources and unrealistic expectations. Success was nearly impossible, but failure was used as proof that Indians needed to be controlled and civilized even more strictly. Children suffered enormously under the reservation system. Starting in the 1870s, the government began forcibly removing Pyute children and sending them to boarding schools, often hundreds of miles away. The most infamous was Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, but there were others closer to Pyute territories. The philosophy behind these schools was explicit cultural destruction dressed up as education. Our children arrived at these schools speaking only Pyute. They were immediately forbidden from using their language, punished physically if they spoke a single word. Their hair was cut, which had spiritual significance that the school administrators either did not know or did not care about. They were dressed in uniforms, given English names, taught Christianity, and drilled in the ways of white civilization. The trauma was profound. Children were torn from families and everything familiar. They were punished for behaviors that were normal in Pyute culture. They were taught that their parents were ignorant savages, and that everything about being Pyute was wrong and shameful. Many children died at these schools from disease, harsh treatment, or broken hearts. Those who survived often returned to reservations no longer fitting in either world, not fully Pyute anymore, but never truly accepted as white either. Parents who resisted sending their children were threatened with imprisonment or having their rations cut off. Families faced impossible choices between keeping their children and having enough food to survive. The government used hunger as a weapon to force compliance with policies designed to erase Pyute culture. Some reservations were so poorly situated that they essentially became open-air prisons where people slowly starved. Walker River Reservation in Nevada, for example, was placed on land that was already marginal and became worse as upstream settlers and ranchers diverted water from the river. The Paiute living there watched their water supply diminish year by year, making survival increasingly difficult while they had no legal recourse to stop it. Other reservations were later reduced in size when valuable minerals were discovered or when white settlers decided they wanted the land after all. Treaties that were supposed to be permanent were rewritten or simply ignored. Land that had been guaranteed to the Pyute was taken back through legal maneuvers or outright theft, and there was nothing they could do about it. The emotional and psychological toll of reservation life was staggering. People who had lived with purpose, autonomy, and dignity found themselves powerless, dependent, and treated as wards of the state. Depression, alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide all increased as traditional social structures broke down under the weight of enforced poverty and cultural destruction. Water was life in the Great Basin, and controlling water meant controlling who could survive there. The Pyute had managed water resources sustainably for centuries, but when white settlers arrived, they brought different ideas about ownership and use. Under Western water law, whoever diverted water first for beneficial use owned the rights to it. This legal framework completely ignored Paiute traditional use and gave advantages to anyone willing to build ditches and dams. Ranchers upstream from reservations would dam streams or dig irrigation canals, reducing the flow of water to Pyute lands downstream. Lakes that had sustained Pyute fishing for generations were drained for agriculture or mining operations. Springs were claimed by settlers who built fences around them and threatened to shoot any Pyute who approached. The Pyute had no legal standing to contest these takings. They had not filed water claims according to white law because they had not known they needed to, and even if they had tried, the system was designed to favor settlers. Pyramid Lake, sacred to the Pyute and central to their fishing economy, began to decline as the Truckee River that fed it was increasingly diverted for irrigation and hydroelectric power. The lake level dropped, the fish populations declined. The Pyute who depended on this lake for food watched it die slowly, unable to stop the process. Legal battles over Pyramid Lake water rights would continue for over a century, a grinding struggle that illustrated how powerless the Paiute were against economic and political forces that valued their survival less than agricultural profit. Land itself was another loss that compounded over time. Even on reservations, the Pyute did not always control their own territory. The Dawes Act of 1887 imposed individual land ownership on reservations, dividing communal land into small plots assigned to individual families. This was presented as giving Indians the same property rights as white citizens, but the real purpose was to break up reservations and make surplus land available for white settlement. The Pyute had no tradition of individual land ownership. Their system had been communal use rights based on kinship and custom. Forcing them into individual ownership created confusion and opportunity for exploitation. Pyute who did not understand the new system could be tricked into selling their allotments for far less than they were worth. Others lost land because they could not pay taxes they did not know they owed. Within a generation, much of the land that had been allotted to individual Pyute families ended up in white hands. Sacred sites were lost to development and desecration. Places where ceremonies had been held for centuries were now off-limits, claimed by ranchers or maining companies who had no knowledge of or respect for their spiritual significance. Burial grounds were plowed under. Rock art sites were vandalized. The spiritual landscape that had been integral to Pyute identity was being erased along with the physical resources that had sustained them. The pine nut forests, so crucial to Pyute survival, were cut down extensively. Miners needed timber for their operations. Railroads needed wood for ties and fuel. Ranchers cleared forests to create grazing land. The pinyon pines that had fed Pyute families for generations disappeared from large areas. And because these trees grow slowly, taking decades to reach nut-bearing maturity, the damage was essentially permanent within human lifetimes. Game animals that the Pyute had hunted sustainably were driven to local extinction or severe decline by commercial hunting and habitat destruction. White hunters killed thousands of rabbits, deer, and antelope, not for food, but for sport or to sell hides. Market hunting devastated animal populations much faster than traditional Paiute hunting ever had. By the early 1900s, many animals that had been abundant were now rare or gone entirely from their historical ranges. The cumulative effect of these losses was the destruction of the entire ecological and economic foundation of Pyute life. Even if they had been given complete freedom to practice traditional ways, the resources those ways depended on no longer existed in sufficient quantities. You cannot gather pine nuts from forests that have been cut down. You cannot fish in lakes that have been drained. You cannot hunt animals that have been exterminated. The land itself had been so altered that traditional knowledge was becoming historical memory rather than practical skill. Pyute elders watched this destruction with helpless grief. They had the knowledge to survive and thrive in the desert, but they could not pass it on effectively to younger generations because the context for that knowledge had been destroyed. Teaching children about seasonal rounds made no sense when the places you went and the resources you gathered were no longer accessible. The intergenerational transfer of culture was breaking down not because people stopped caring, but because the world that culture had been adapted to no longer existed. But the Pyute did not disappear. Despite everything designed to destroy them, they survived. This survival was not passive acceptance. It was active resistance, adaptation, and determination to maintain identity, even when the world was trying to erase it. Some Pyute learned to navigate the white system while maintaining their cultural identity in private. They worked wage jobs on ranches and farms, earning money that provided economic security their ancestors never needed, but that was essential in the new reality. They learned English but spoke Pyute at home. They attended churches but also practiced traditional spiritual ceremonies in secret. They became skilled at code switching, showing whites what they expected to see while preserving what mattered most in spaces beyond white observation. Women continued making baskets even when there was little market for them, because basket making was not just craft but cultural continuity. Each basket represented knowledge passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. The patterns woven into baskets told stories, marked identity, connected present to past. Making baskets was an act of resistance against cultural erasure, a quiet insistence that Pyute knowledge and art would not die no matter what policies tried to kill them. And language preservation happened in kitchens and around fires where elders told stories to children. Even when boarding schools punished Paiute language use, even when speaking the language could get you beaten, some families insisted their children learn it anyway. They taught vocabulary, grammar, stories, songs. They kept the language alive in whispers and secret lessons, understanding that losing language meant losing the ability to think in certain ways, to express concepts that had no English equivalent, to be fully Pyute. Traditional knowledge was adapted to new circumstances. Pyute, who could no longer follow seasonal rounds through vast territories, found ways to apply traditional ecological knowledge to small reservation gardens. They could not gather from pinyon forests, but they could identify edible plants in new areas. They could not hunt across open ranges, but they taught children to observe animal behavior and understand natural systems. The specific practices changed, but the underlying knowledge and values persisted. Some Pyute found ways to reclaim pieces of their heritage that had been stolen. They tracked down children who had been taken to boarding schools and brought them home when they could. They collected stories and recorded them, creating written archives of oral traditions that might otherwise have been lost. They fought legal battles, almost always losing but establishing precedents and laying groundwork for future struggles. The ghost dance movement of the 1890s showed both desperation and hope. This was a spiritual revival movement that spread among many Western tribes, including some Pyute bands. The belief was that performing certain dances and ceremonies would bring back the dead, restore the buffalo, and make white people disappear. It was unrealistic, but it reflected profound longing for a world that had been lost and deep faith that somehow things could be made right again. White authorities feared the ghost dance as potential uprising preparation and violently suppressed it. The most famous suppression was the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota, but Paiute ghost dancers also faced arrests and intimidation. The movement eventually faded as the promised transformation did not materialize, but it demonstrated that the Pyute had not given up on the possibility of change, had not accepted their destruction as final. Into the 20th century, conditions on reservations remained difficult, but Pyute communities found ways to create new forms of social cohesion. They held powwows that brought scattered families together. They organized tribal councils to represent their interests to government authorities more effectively. They began documenting injustices and advocating for treaty rights that had been violated. Progress was glacially slow, but it was progress nonetheless. World War I and World War II saw many Pyute men serve in the U.S. military, fighting for a country that had treated them as less than citizens. Some enlisted out of economic necessity, some out of a warrior tradition that valued courage and service, some hoping that military service would finally earn their people the respect and rights that should have been theirs all along. They served with distinction, and like many Native American veterans, came home to find that their heroism abroad did not translate to equality at home. The mid-1900s brought new challenges and opportunities. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 allowed tribes more self-governance, though within strict federal oversight. Some Pyute tribes wrote constitutions and established elected governments. This gave them more say in their own affairs, though ultimate authority still rested with federal agencies that often had different priorities. Economic development became possible in limited ways. Some tribes started small businesses, others leased land or resources under terms that at least gave them some income and control. Gaming came later, providing revenue that allowed some tribes to invest in education, healthcare, and cultural preservation in ways that had never been possible under complete federal dependency. Through all of this, the Pyute never stopped being Pyute. They adapted, they struggled, they sometimes compromised, but they maintained core identity. Today there are multiple Pyute tribes, each federally recognized with their own governments, territories, and challenges. The Pyramid Lake Pyute tribe, the Walker River Pyute tribe, the Burns Pyute tribe, and others continue to exist despite everything that was done to eliminate them. They are not large populations. Centuries of disease, violence, and dispossession reduced their numbers dramatically, but they are still here. Modern Pyute communities face ongoing struggles. Many reservations still have high poverty rates, inadequate infrastructure, and limited economic opportunities. Health outcomes are often worse than national averages. Education systems struggle with limited funding. The historical trauma of genocide and cultural destruction creates intergenerational effects that do not heal quickly. These are real, serious problems that cannot be ignored or romanticized away. But there are also successes worth celebrating. Language revitalization programs are teaching Paiute languages to children and adults who want to reconnect with that part of their heritage. Elders work with linguists to create dictionaries, teaching materials, and recordings that preserve language for future generations. Some schools now offer Paiute language classes, reversing decades of policies that punished children for speaking anything but English. Cultural centers on various reservations preserve and display traditional arts, crafts, and knowledge. Basket makers teach young people the techniques that their grandmothers learned. Storytellers share traditional narratives. Historians document Pyute perspectives on events that official histories got wrong or ignored completely. These centers serve both the Paiute community and educate outsiders who want to learn the truth about the people whose land they live on. Legal victories have reclaimed some rights and resources. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe has fought for decades to protect their lake and has won important court cases establishing their water rights. These victories do not undo the damage or restore everything that was lost, but they represent hard-fought steps toward justice and sustainability. The lake will never be what it was before white settlement, but at least it has a future now. And some Pyute tribes have developed economic enterprises that provide jobs and revenue. Gaming operations, while controversial, have given some tribes financial independence they never had under federal dependency. That money funds schools, clinics, elder care, cultural programs, and infrastructure improvements. Economic self-sufficiency is not a complete solution to historical injustice, but it beats waiting for government handouts that never adequately arrive. Collaboration with scientists and land managers has brought Paiute traditional ecological knowledge into modern environmental management, fire management, water conservation, habitat restoration. These are areas where Paiute knowledge accumulated over centuries has practical applications that benefit everyone. Slowly, there is growing recognition that the people who lived sustainably in the Great Basin for 1,000 years might actually know things about managing that landscape that Western science is only beginning to understand. Younger Pyute are finding ways to be both modern and traditional. They attend colleges, pursue professional careers, engage with contemporary culture, while also learning traditional skills, speaking the language, participating in ceremonies, and maintaining connections to their heritage. This is not abandoning tradition. This is adapting it to survive in the 21st century, the same way their ancestors adapted to survive the 19th. Social media and internet connectivity have allowed Pyute people to connect across distances in ways that were impossible before. Families separated by geography can share language lessons, art, cultural knowledge, and support. Tribes can coordinate on political advocacy and legal strategies. Young people can find community and role models. The same technology that often homogenizes cultures is also being used to preserve and strengthen Pyute identity. There are also painful ongoing reckonings with the past. Archaeological sites on Pyute traditional lands are sometimes disturbed by development. Remains of ancestors are occasionally discovered and must be reburied with proper ceremony. Symbols and names that are sacred to the Pyute are sometimes used inappropriately by businesses or sports teams. Each of these incidents requires energy to address, reopening wounds while fighting for basic respect. Climate change poses new threats to the Great Basin and to Pyute communities. Droughts are becoming more severe, or water sources are less reliable. Traditional plants and animals are shifting ranges or disappearing. The ecological knowledge that has been so carefully preserved may need to adapt to a changing climate, adding another layer of challenge to cultural continuity. But the Pyute have survived climate changes before. The Great Basin has cycled through droughts and wet periods for millennia, and the Pyute adapted. They have already proven their resilience across centuries of far more rapid and violent changes than climate shift. If any people have the cultural memory and adaptive capacity to handle environmental change, it is those who have been doing it successfully for 1,000 years. The next generations will determine what Pyute culture looks like in the future, but the fact that there will be future generations, that the Pyute continue to exist and grow, is itself a victory against everything that tried to eliminate them. So why does the Pyute story matter? Why should we care about people who are often just a footnote in Old West histories focused on cowboys, outlaws, and gold rushes? because their story reveals uncomfortable truths about how the American West was really won. It was not won through rugged individualism and frontier spirit alone. It was won by taking land from people who were already using it successfully, by destroying ecological systems that had been managed sustainably for centuries, by implementing policies designed to eliminate cultures that got in the way of profit and expansion. The Pyute were not primitive people waiting for civilization. They had sophisticated knowledge systems, complex social structures, and sustainable relationships with a harsh environment. They were managing the Great Basin successfully when European ancestors of most Americans were still living in feudal societies. The idea that they needed to be civilized was based on prejudice and self-interest, not on any objective assessment of their capabilities or achievements. Their displacement was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by governments, individuals, and societies that valued land and resources more than human rights or cultural diversity. Treaties could have been honored, water rights could have been respected, reservations could have been adequately supplied. Children did not have to be taken from families. These were choices, and different choices would have produced different outcomes. The fact that the Pyute story is so often overlooked in popular narratives about the Old West is itself revealing. We prefer stories about brave pioneers overcoming wilderness, about outlaws and lawmen, about gold strikes and cattle drives. These are more comfortable narratives than stories about theft, genocide, and cultural destruction. But history is not comfortable, and ignoring the uncomfortable parts does not make them less true. Understanding what happened to the Pyute changes how we think about the land we live on. If you live in Nevada, Utah, California, Oregon, or Idaho, you are living on land that was Pyute territory. The cities, farms, ranches, and mines exist where they do, because the Pyute were removed. The water you drink was once managed by people who understood desert hydrology better than modern engineers. The mountains you hike were sacred spaces before they were recreational areas. This is not about guilt. The people living in the Great Basin today did not personally dispossess the Pyute, but it is about recognition and honesty. Knowing the history, understanding that the conveniences and opportunities we enjoy came at tremendous cost to others, creates responsibility to at least acknowledge that cost and support the descendants of those who paid it. The Pyute also offer lessons that are increasingly relevant as we face environmental challenges. They managed resources sustainably for centuries in an environment that is difficult and becoming more difficult under climate change. Their traditional knowledge about water conservation, fire management, and ecosystem preservation is not primitive superstition, and it is accumulated wisdom that modern society is only beginning to appreciate. Bringing Pyute perspectives into land management, water policy, and environmental planning is not just about justice for historical wrongs. It is about practical benefit. People who successfully lived in the Great Basin for 1,000 years know things about surviving in that environment that recent arrivals do not. Ignoring that knowledge because of prejudice or arrogance is foolish. The survival of the Pyute, despite everything that was done to eliminate them, is testament to human resilience. They faced disease, violence, starvation, forced relocation, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts to erase their identity. They should not have survived. By any reasonable calculation, they should have disappeared. But they are still here, are still fighting for their rights, still preserving their culture, still insisting on being recognized as the original people of the Great Basin. That survival matters because it proves that cultures can persist through catastrophe if people are determined enough. It shows that traditional knowledge and identity can adapt to modern circumstances without being completely erased. It demonstrates that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, that long struggles can eventually bear fruit. The Pyute story is not over. It continues in language classes, cultural centers, legal battles, and everyday choices by Pyute people to maintain their identity in a world that still does not fully recognize or value them. Their future depends partly on their own efforts and partly on whether the larger society that displaced them will finally honor commitments made and acknowledge truths long denied. If this story opened your eyes to a piece of the Old West that usually gets ignored, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Tomorrow we are telling the story of Bass Reeves, the black deputy marshal who arrested more outlaws than any lawman in the frontier, but who history almost forgot. The Old West is full of overlooked stories about people who deserve to be remembered, and we are bringing every one of them to light. See you in the next story.